How's it going, everybody? My name is Anthony Simmons, and I'm here with the Broadview Public Library, and it is Black Music Month. Black Music Month is a tradition that's been nationally recognized and celebrated in America since 1979. So today we're going to be taking a trip down history to explore some of the foundations in the music processes that were used in the creation of different styles of Black originated music. Advancements in electronic music have allowed for us to be able to reproduce these styles, albeit maybe lacking a bit of authenticity, but without the necessity for hundreds of thousands of dollars in studio equipment or even a band. So yeah, let's get into it. Now, the blues and jazz music are far too diverse genres, and essentially periods in American history, to define how they were recorded in the span of this video. The blues can nearly be considered the foundation of contemporary American music. Black Americans created their own styles of sacred religious music and folk music, and that greatly influenced the cultural and social lives of African Americans. Blues music, being a type of folk music, was no different. The blues took many different forms across a bunch of American regions, including the Mississippi Delta, Memphis, Chicago, Southern Texas, and each regional manifestation of the blues featured a uniquely identifiable sound and message. Jazz was developing at the same time in the more urban environment of New Orleans and St. Louis, but the South had Jim Crow laws, and the black population was economically and culturally repressed. Black performers couldn't record their music, and white groups like the original Dixieland Jazz Band ended up making the first jazz recordings. But in 1920, a woman named Mamie Smith released the song Crazy Blues, which went on to sell 75,000 $1 copies in just its first month. After that type of commercial success, many other blues singers were recorded from large companies, and the radio stations and record companies marketed black music to a black audience. So jazz and blues were largely confined to the black community until after World War II. During this time period, the technology of recorded sound was in its earliest stages. Musicians were recorded solely in real time, and performances were captured on master disc in some of the first recording studios, or they were recorded in field recordings. Later on in the 1920s, the invention of the electronic microphone removed the need for singers to sing loudly above an entire ensemble. So this allowed for a more quiet and intimate style of singing to emerge. Jazz and blues have both evolved throughout the decades, and while they don't stand as the pop music of America anymore, the genres have never truly died by a long shot. And today we have the capability to reproduce these styles in the comfort of our own home studio. Due to the authenticity and musicianship involved in these genres, it's nearly as difficult and time-consuming to make a jazz or blues track feel real electronically as it is to find musicians to actually play the record. So what we can do for these genres is simply create an outline of a jazz track given the instrumental components and the music theory typical of a jazz track. So what we're going to do is just create a standard 12-bar blues backing track, and we're going to use the chord progressions and the instruments typical of this style. Logic has an assortment of different pianos and different instruments that can emulate this sort of feel. Alright, so since we're starting with jazz, I'm not going to lie to you, this is not exactly my forte, so don't laugh. But we have a little simple 12-bar blues melody here, or a 12-bar blues chord progression, and basically all that is we're going to talk a little bit about theory. In jazz or blues theory, at least with a 12-bar blues progression, basically you figure out the key that you're in. So the way that you do that is, say you start with the note of C, you would be in the key of C. So that would make C your first chord, and then you know your other chords by the chord numbers. 12-bar blues goes from 1 to the 4, back to the 1, 5, 4, and 1. Some of the chord numberings repeat. We don't have to get too deep into the theory of it, but I'll just show you how it goes as we bring these instruments in. So we'll start with just the bass and the piano here, just to get the groove and the feel of the chord progression. So this is the first chord numbering here that we start on, and I'll count them out as we play. 1, we go to 4, then back to 1. We go 5, 4, 1, 1. And then yeah, you just repeat that over and over, and then usually there's like some sort of soloist or somebody doing something within this progression, you know, just jazzing it up a little bit. So yeah, let me bring in the rest of these instruments so you can see how the whole thing sounds together. We have an acoustic guitar, just kind of following the chord progression along with the piano. And then we have drums, just playing a typical swing. And then we have on the accents some horns. And that's all there is to it. And that's 12-bar blues. There are much better iterations of this out on the interwebs that you can find. But yeah, this basically just goes over, because like I said, jazz and blues are very diverse genres, and they cover, you know, from big bands to swing to ballads, and you know, there are solos, and blues can have a more down-tempo feel where there's some really up-tempo jazz. And you know, there's bebop, and there is, you know, there's a lot of subgenres of these two different genres. So this is just one sort of example of it, but I just, you know, wanted to show you how you can use Logic to emulate the chord progressions and the instrumentation. You got your horns here, a tenor sax, trumpet, and a trombone that are playing those accents. You got an acoustic guitar, and you have a piano here, and an upright bass, which are all instruments typical of jazz back in the 20s all the way through the 50s, and then, you know, it started to progress into more instruments and other things later, but this is typically how it started off. And then I have this cool plug-in here called vinyl that you probably hear is making a little bit of crackling, as a vinyl would, you know, if you let it age, and it just kind of takes the fidelity of it down a little bit, give it a more realistic feel. Instruments are down tuned, you know, so you can kind of get that vinyl feel out of it. There would have to be some tweaking obviously done to this too, but and that's jazz and blues for you. Rock, also known as rock and roll, is a genre people often forget has its roots in Black American history as well. It's a genre that originated in the 1950s, and while many instruments can be found in the rock records of today, its primary instrumental elements have always been electric guitar, bass guitar, and drums. So there have been many names attributed to the beginning of rock music, and if you didn't do too much digging, you may find that one of the most famous names in music history, Elvis Presley, popularized rock music in America throughout the 50s. While this was true, his discography, style, and his presentation was predominantly derived from minority artists who were not allowed to record in recording studios at the time. So names such as Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Bo Diddley, Gory Carter, Jackie Brenston, and many more are all the true pioneers of the shaping of the rhythm and blues and country and gospel music in the early to mid 50s into the format that we now know as rock and roll. However, there's a lesser known hero of the genre, and that is a black woman by the name Rosetta Tharpe, aka the godmother of rock and roll. She created the roots of the rock format by combining the gospel music that she grew up with, the growing popularity of swing jazz music, and the blues as early as 1938. And she had an amazingly influential career, and she pushed the boundaries of music every year throughout the 40s, and she even became idolized by Elvis, Chuck Berry, and Johnny Cash. Rock music of the 50s was being recorded to tape, as that had become the standard of recording by this time. Since multi-track recorders at the time could not handle more than a few tracks, each instrument was mic'd using only one microphone per instrument, including the drums, and we can kind of create the elements of a rock song electronically now by using virtual instruments that emulate guitar, bass, and drums. So, rock is another one of those genres that, since it started pre-digital recording era and pre-large-scale multi-track recording, you had to play it through one take, and the musicians had to be good, and you would run it back over and over until you got it right. But now that we do have digital stuff, we're going to try and replicate it here. And it can be really time-consuming to get these instruments to sound realistic, like I said, but It's all about instrument selection, and it's all about the mixing of it and just getting the human feel of these genres to come out and kind of stand out so that it doesn't sound super, computerized. So I didn't quite get too deep into the mixing or the sound selection here. I'm using some Logic stock stuff, which is okay, but not the most realistic sounding. And then I'm using a couple of Native Instruments plugins. That's just a company that they make a lot of better, more realistic sounding instruments, but even still, it takes some tweaking to get them to sound really authentic. So let's just start here by listening to the track and seeing what we have. I'll start with the drums and the bass, two primary components of rock. And as you see, we just got like a nice groove going, walking bass. And then we'll bring in, this would be actually the backing guitar. Just playing the chords in the background, giving it some accents. And we have a solo. Not necessarily a solo, but a lead guitar, which could go into a solo later. But we just got some rolls, kind of piano-ish, organist sound to round out those chords. So we can start to kind of see by soloing and adding or removing things how the elements fit together. We have that groove coming from here, from those accents happening on those syncopated beats, which actually kind of takes us into funk, which is our next thing. And then we have the bass just holding down the low end, the drums keeping the groove, and the lead guitar kind of wailing out above everything to give it some energy. And then just like with the jazz blues track, you can throw a little vinyl plug-in on it here. Kind of, detune it a little bit. That's a little bit more than I would want, but yeah, you detune it a little, and you get some of that tape sound, some of that vinyl sound to it. And yeah, that's our replication of rock. Funk records began to take over the music of the black community in the 1960s. It's a combination of elements from many different genres as well, including R&B, jazz, blues, and gospel. Funk as a musical genre is characteristic of its syncopated drums and its bass guitar rhythms, and each element contributing to a sort of groove. The word funk itself is a slang term with a sort of indistinct definition, and it fits into many different circumstances because it's been used to describe a bad odor, or a groovy track, or a state of sadness, in many other positive and negative situations. The word really signifies an association with harsh realities that expressed an unsettling yet undeniable truth about life. It's a reflection of the black experience, as it's become one of many terms now that have a negative connotation but are now used in the term of endearment or as a compliment. James Brown recorded a song in 1965 called Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, which is considered to be the first funk song. Tweaks and innovations in the genre continued throughout the late 60s, with James Brown's drummer, Clyde Stubblefield, frequently performing drum solos on his tracks, including the iconic funky drummer beat that has become a staple in music that withstands even today. While James Brown remained primarily on the stage and only recorded to wax through smaller record labels, many Motown artists perpetuated the funk epidemic, and it became a staple of the American popular music scene throughout the 70s and the 80s. Motown, however, while employing funk artists in their arsenal, was more synonymous with the R&B and the pop feels of this era. During this time, multi-track recording to tape was still the dominant technique being used in the studio. It still required bands to perform songs completely from start to finish, but it allowed for more shaping of the sound and even cutting between the best of all recorded takes. Alright, so funk moves us into the 50s and 60s, or funk in the Motown R&B era. 50s through the early 70s. And we get a little bit more room to work. We get a bit more. They had multi-tracking tools that allowed for, you know, different takes to be cut in between, and for there to be a little bit more shaping of the sound. So we have some amps here and some. Everything's still analog, but just some components to make it sound more modern. And we'll just start the same way we did with the last two genres, with the bass and the drums, just to get a feel for the groove of this genre, and then we'll start adding in instruments as we go. Kind of a replication of Clyde Stubblefield's Funky Drummer here, a little bit of a twist on it. Bass line is definitely derivative as well. Then we can throw in the piano here. So there's definitely elements of both Motown, R&B, and funk inside this, which they were synonymous. They're the same time period. So yeah, tracks could end up, you know, meshing between the two. And then we'll throw in the guitar, which has some background chords going. And then usually, you know, this would be all that was necessary, and the singer would carry the rest of the energy for the song. But then they would come to a chorus, and then you would have some horns come in. And the horns would probably have just, you know, a little bit of reverb on them. Give them a little bit more energy. Now, funk and Motown era songs were still, for the most part, played all the way through. But the producer did just have a little bit more leeway, a little bit more room to stop and start things. But for the most part, these bands were, you know, and not for the most part, these bands were all, you know, incredible. They had incredible musicians, and they were able to play these songs outright because, you know, they would go on tour and they would do the same thing. So yeah, this is just kind of an emulation, and again, sound selection is key. You know, picking horns that sounded like they were from that era, rhythms that sound like they go with the funk groove, a bass guitar that instead of like the upright bass, we're using an electric bass with the amplifier on it, which is more typical of that era. So yeah, that's our funk track. Let's get into the next genre. So disco was the wild and unpredictable music of the 70s, and it started off being a mixture of many different genres, as most genres do. It became known for the straight beat kick that creates a sort of walking feeling, and the defining quality of disco is the groove. It has roots in black and Latin music, and it gained its popularity in the queer bars and clubs of the underground music scene of the time. It gave birth to the modern DJ, or the disc jockey, which gives disco music its name. So by the mid-70s, black women dominated the sound of disco, with artists like Donna Summer, Grace Jones, Anita Ward, and LaBelle, and others creating a revolution for women's expressiveness in music. However, disco's mainstream dominance was short-lived, as the rock and country community spearheaded efforts to villainize disco music and the culture it represented. Disco, however, still lives on through many forms of music today, such as techno, EDM, house music, and other genres and subgenres that it ended up splitting into. The other way, though, that it revolutionized pop music was how it changed the average length of a song substantially. So before disco, the 7-inch record was the standard format, allowing for 3 or so minutes per side, and thus that was the standard length of a radio song. However, because disco was made predominantly for the dance floor, DJs began demanding longer songs in order to keep the groove going without the work it took to do this in 3-minute increments. And so was born the 12-inch vinyl single, which allowed for higher fidelity music and longer songs on one side of vinyl. So this vinyl pretty much became the standard, and the average length of songs nearly doubled by the 80s. Alright, so here we have my rendition of a disco track, and this one's a good bit more involved because I actually had this one made quite some time back, and we got a little bit more mixing elements and stuff here. But at the core of it, it's still, you know, the same things that make this track tick, which is, you know, picking the right instruments in the right groove for the genre you're going for. So we know that disco was very, you know, typical of that straight beat kick or 4 on the floor. And yeah, just like a very dance-esque kind of groove to it. So I'm just gonna solo out the drums for you so you can hear what I mean by that. I actually decided to not go with the 4 on the floor kick though, because later on in the disco eras you do start to kind of see some variation on that, but there is still a very straight beat feel, and there are other drum instruments that, you know, kind of fill in the gaps where I didn't have the kick playing. So you'll see what I mean. So you have the kick and the snare pretty much holding down that 4 on the floor. And then we have the bass guitar. That's a very straight beat, which also helps keep that same sort of groove of disco. We have Latin percussion in here because disco is very typical of both the Black and the Latin community. And then I threw some keys in, and I'm just going to let this play out a little bit so you can hear how it evolves. Keys have some effecting done to it, some flanging, and some wah sounds, because we had the ability to, you know, introduce electronic components at this point. And this would be, you know, the verse, where the singer would, you know, probably be doing what the singer does. But at the end of the day, it's the groove that really matters in disco, because you want to keep the dance and the energy on the dance floor going. Bring some guitars in. And the 70s and 80s was the era of the synthesizer, which is kind of incorporated into this as well. And another instrument you will commonly hear in disco is strings, especially when the energy wants to get pushed up. And yeah, that's typically how disco tracks went. This one definitely diverts a little bit from your standard disco track, because like I said, the kick will usually be playing on every beat. This definitely is kind of funk mixed in with kick, based on how I did the drums. But at the same time, you know, the instrument selection is still there, and you still have the same sort of instrumentation that you would have had in a disco track. So, as we know, hip-hop music is one of the most popular forms of music in America today. It dominates the Billboard charts regularly, and it traverses into many other genres. It's thought to have been pioneered by a man named Clyde Campbell, also known as DJ Kool Herc. The hip-hop scene began as an underground movement that happened around the same time that disco began to dominate the music scene. In fact, it was also another form of rebellion to the disco scene, as the DJs of hip-hop would specifically loop the instrumental drum and bass grooves known as the breakdown, which were commonly found in funk and disco songs, and they would omit the majority of the lyrics and the more vibrant parts of the song. So, along with the DJs who spun these breakdowns, usually came an MC, responsible for bringing energy through the crowd through yelling chants and calls and responses to the crowd. The MC later evolved into the rapper, which took the verbal essence of an MC and then it added a lyrical and a rhythmic element, and that rounded out the full experience of what we know hip-hop to have evolved into today. So hip-hop and R&B have also been closely related pretty much since the inception of hip-hop, and those have persisted and evolved for decades along with the music industry. So they've also seen many different technological advances, and thus many different types of recording and production techniques employed in the creation of new music within the two genres. So while originally being a completely live performed genre at house parties and block parties in the 70s, hip-hop eventually moved to locally distributed cassette tapes, and they were played in boom boxes, which gave way to the mixtape. Now, hip hop lives everywhere, from the home hobbyist studio to the multi-million-dollar label studios of Cali, New York, and Chicago. Okay, so for the hip hop beat, I decided to just bring us right into the modern age. I decided to do this for a couple of reasons. The first being because we've already done 4 different genres where we try and emulate old school styles in the real sounding instruments with electronic components. But the motto here again is sound selection, and I want to show why it's important to have electronic sounding components when you are working within a genre that utilizes that sort of thing. In the 70s and 80s, hip hop was basically all sampling. It was more so DJs that were creating the beats behind hip hop, and MCs or rappers were creating it into the musical style and genre that it became. But because it was coming straight from funk records and straight from disco records, those instruments sounded, the same way that they did on those records, and they just, took certain elements out of there. Whereas when the 90s and the 2000s came, we started to have a lot more freedom to create our own components with inside of beats. And hip hop is a completely different thing now. We're not doing the hippity hop thing or the boom bap thing anymore. We're it's spread into like a lot of different genres. So I utilized a couple of different elements. I have a sample here. It's kind of a rock sample, so it just shows how hip hop today can cross blend into a lot of different genres. But the drums are completely electronic, as they have been, but they are meant to sound electronic. And then we have keyboard, guitar sounding instruments here, because when synthesizers became virtual, we just had so many options to create our own sounds. And I mean, you did on old synthesizers too, but now we have that ability right in the power of our computers without buying $1,000 synthesizers. So I'll just start this beat from the beginning and I'll explain it as we go. So here's our rock sample, and then we have our hi-hats and kicks and claps and our percussion. And then we have our 808, which is something that showed up in the 80s with the Roland 808, actually synthesizer, but it's become a whole different thing as well. And as you can see with this beat, there's not a lot going on. The drums are pretty much carrying it. We have a couple more, backing chords and stuff coming in a little bit later, but the drums do the work mostly for hip hop. This would be typical of a hip hop intro going into a chorus, and then you would probably remove some elements and go to the verse. And that's pretty much it. That's how hip hop beats a lot of times go. I know a lot of people like to discredit the validity and the musicality of hip hop, but it takes a lot to know what to put in and where to put it in and how to make those elements combine. Because while the beats can be simplistic, not everything goes together. So definitely make sure sound selection is one of your top priorities, no matter what genre you're working in. So that's all we got for today. I really enjoyed making this video. It was really great for me to learn about all the history of black recorded music, and it was great for me to try and get into the mindset of these older musicians of the past and try and figure out how they did what they did to make the genres that we know today. I hope you can take something from this. I hope you can take some history. I hope you can also take some recording techniques back to your own studios and learn to make the type of music that you want to make. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.